Central European populism. So we are very curious on your presentation, which title is Wind of Change Under Tatras, Slovakia between Mafia State and Liberal Democracy.
Thank you very much. That was very normative. I will try not to be that normative, but I understood that Istvan is expecting us to be relatively positive. I'm well known to be apocalyptic and to poison a bride during a wedding night. But this time I will try to be relatively positive, although the picture is more complex and my presentation is differing slightly from previous ones. It's probably because I was supposed to be yesterday at the conference. I was not able to come. But referring to what we heard about European elections, to just destroy that positive image of Slovakia right at the beginning, Slovakia is well known for having extremely low turnout in European elections, actually the lowest one. In last elections it was 13.5, so you can compare it to all your countries and you know that Slovakia will probably be competing for the last position again, but it's probably with slightly better results. Okay. I was asked to speak about recent developments in Slovakia, and probably, most likely because of victory of Zuzana Čaputová in presidential elections 2 weeks ago, and probably also because it was perceived not only in Hungary but in many countries as a small miracle, or let me quote from so-called Western press, a rare victory for liberal forces in Central Europe. I'm not completely buying that argument that it was such a miracle, bearing in mind the dynamic of Slovakia in last years, and also viewing the situation in many other Central European countries, and I will come to that. And let me show you that, of course, in a relatively short time, Slovakia might be one of those liberal democracies that we still know from some parts of Western Europe, or it can be very illiberal or anti-European country after next parliamentary elections in March 2020. Both options are at the moment open. So my presentation is divided into 3 parts. So let me firstly summarize where we are in the context of Central Europe, and I will be harsh right at the beginning. What we are experiencing these days in Central Europe is the end of liberal consensus about the future of the region. The region started to backslide back in time into illiberal democracies, procedural democracies, soft autocracies, hybrid forms of authoritarianism. And the most important thing, as unpleasant as it may be, Central Europe may have become laboratory of events that will also affect the West. And they are actually affecting. If we consider Italy as a Western country, then it's definitely affecting. And I can name, of course, Austria, and to a certain extent even Germany. And sitting in Hungary these days, knowing how Viktor Orban is relatively influential, at least in Bavaria, I wouldn't underestimate that impact. The combination of frustration, hopelessness, fear of globalization with rapidly growing influence of social networks and conspiracy theories creates a truly toxic cocktail that is only waiting to be sized by a skillful ideologue. In case of Slovakia was since 1989 very different in comparison to the rest of Central Europe, and all those periods I would probably somehow try to conceptualize them in this way. In 1990 to 1992 it was kind of an emerging democracy in the same way as in other countries. Then it turned into colonized democracy, and in 1994, 1998, and you might remember that period, Madeleine Albright mentioned that Slovakia was a black hole on the map of Central Europe, and she was right. It was clearly illiberal democracy. Waking call came even from people like Farid Zakaria, who mentioned that there is basically no difference between Sierra Leone and Slovakia. And I can assure you that people in Bratislava were shocked when they heard that. So that brought certain procedural democracy, proto-liberal democracies under 2 governments of Prime Minister Dzurinda. And then, slowly but systematically, we shifted toward oligarchic democracy with a very short period of liberal democracy under Iveta Radičová. And since 2016, I would use the term mafia democracy, and I'm referring to something what is well known in Hungary. Bálint Magyar was writing about it a lot. A state where basically oligarchs are not competing for various various state money, because the oligarchization is basically completed. There is and it's completely power is monopolized. And Slovakia was heading very quickly toward that model, and then suddenly the murder of Kuciak came, and Slovakia changed quite visibly, and I will be speaking about it. Speaking about economic performance, Slovakia is still among those countries which were benefiting. I mean, just try to compare it with some other countries. Slovakia is change in GDP per capita in between 1995 2016. Slovakia is definitely among victorious. Speaking about the core, the Slovaks were obsessed by becoming a core, unlike Hungarians, Czechs, and Poles. Slovaks basically were part of every single unit you can think of, and they were believing that Germans will bring us to the core. And after all, Porsche Cayenne is produced not in Germany but in Bratislava these days, so Slovaks were very optimistic. Speaking about something else, and we sociologists were not that optimistic, because bearing in mind historical roots of civic and political culture in Slovakia, we knew that the chances for establishing liberal democracy in Slovakia are not the greatest. I mean, on purpose, I picked up the picture of a Slovak peasant from the end of 19th century. This is basically like Hungarians portray Slovaks, usually Czechs as well, by the way. And the country is not only Slovakia, of course, in the context of Central Europe, but if I would be asked in a nutshell, how to define historical roots of civic and political culture, which have direct implications on how people think, how they behave, what are their patterns of behavior. Lack of historical consciousness of Slovaks. This is very different in comparison to other countries. Deep egalitarianism, which means strong anti-liberal traditions. Lack of trust, of course, as in many other countries. State paternalism, clientelism, and in the same way as in Poland and Hungary, and unlike in the Czech Republic, unfinished modernization. So the gap between cultural dimension of modernity and structural dimension of modernity is still very, very high. And in the whole context of Central Europe, Slovakia is suffering by the same problems as other countries in Central Europe, of course. As Jascha Monk is rightly pointing out that we are living in both undemocratic liberalism, this technocratization that is overwhelming the whole space, is combined with non-liberal democracy in our countries. And if you think about most of Western European countries, they have undemocratic liberalism, but at least they have liberal democracy, and we are suffering by both of these problematic issues. I was relatively positive about economic results of Slovakia. It of course brought also certain neoliberal policies of the end of 90s and beginning of this century, brought unprecedented changes especially in rural areas of Slovakia. The result is that Slovakia is among those 3 countries of European Union where you have fascists in parliament. Now I'm talking about Slovakia, Hungary, and Greece. I'm not talking about populists, I'm not talking about unpleasant right-wing populists, but I'm talking about fascists. This is our fascist, and their success is somehow destroying the general wisdom why these people are successful. Many were saying that it's about deep frustration of unemployed people, it's about losers of transformation, it's about uneducated people, or it's reflecting lack of lack of pro-Roma policies that would change the situation of marginalized people. Well, not really. I mean, these people are rather employed. This is a typical voter of the fascist party, educated, daily user of internet, usually deeply believing in conspiracy theories. Other neighbor is absent. Other neighbor means Roma. So it's something else also. And in the same way as in Hungary, it's coming also from the history, and we shouldn't be surprised that those people are there. What happened last year was actually a relatively simple case. Jan Kuciak was writing about quite dangerous connections between Italian mafia, Slovak oligarchs, and Prime Minister of Slovakia, and we still don't know what dimensions we should actually search for, because there are many theories now. When we know that Italians many believe that they are out of the whole game, but many others are saying that actually the whole game was about smuggling drugs into Central Europe, and those connections are going actually up to former Prime Minister through his lover, who was sent basically by Italian mafia. I mean, the picture is very gloomy, very problematic, but simply at the end of the day, Jan Kuciak was murdered. This is Jan Kuciak with his fiancée, and the reaction of people to the murder of two young people when they realize that they are living in oligarchic society, which is ready even to murder people who would uncover their artificial world, shocked the world, but it didn't shock us, because it was the same basically as in 1989 during the Velvet Revolution. Slovak society suddenly awaked, and overnight the Slovak society understood that it lives in a state that has been kidnapped and transferred into mafia state. Well, this is basically the scheme how they were connected. The people at the governmental office. You see also the lover who was sent by Italian mafia. And just recently we learned that while she was a lover of our former Prime Minister, they were actually making phone calls with the top Italian mafia guy practically every day. So Italians sent us recently 465 phone calls, which were made during 1 year. So it means almost 2 phone calls a day. But let me mention something very important. Many do not want to admit it nowadays in Slovakia, but it all started at the beginning of the transformation process in early 1990. Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, the first Czechoslovak president, idea that states are reproducing by ideas on which they were founded is very topical these days. And honestly, independent Slovakia did not emerge as an expression and outcome of the millennial emancipation effort of the Slovak nation, which is this nationalistic narrative in Slovakia, but it is in particular as a materialization of an effort to create a new Slovak economic elite and to privatize as much of the former state property as possible. And the same was basically on the Czech side. So without a referendum, Czechoslovakia was split, and since basically those who established independent Slovakia wanted to have as great robbery of the state property as possible, this is a result. So we shouldn't be actually so much surprised in this. But the octopus really of the dark forces caught the country with a strong shriek, and until now does not want to let it go. February 1918 was an impulse, and many people were, the cynical players of the Slovak government were surprised. Political elite, without even knowing sociology, without sociological education, correctly estimated where the Slovak society shifted. Society became very cynical and anomic, full of distrust on both horizontal and vertical levels. It became nihilist. So suddenly, in that way, they expected that the game might actually be running endlessly. But suddenly, people became, in a way, free, and barriers have fallen. And many people basically said, enough is enough. And they began to speak, and this is what we see on all levels of the state administration these days. General prosecutor, police, judiciary, all those structures were almost completely paralyzed by Fico's oligarchy government. And now, systematically, one block after another, it's starting to fall down, and people start to speak. And the result, of course, are visible already. And people, honestly speaking, people in Slovakia, week after week, they are astonished to find themselves in this Alice in the Wonderland situation, and they start to discover how deep is the rabbit hole. And it's shocking, honestly speaking, even for those of us who knew what is happening, but sometimes those nuances are even funny. So what happened? Suddenly, and now I'm approaching to the whole issue why Zuzana Čaputová was elected, because it didn't come from nowhere. Immediately after murder of Kuciak, Initiative for Decent Slovakia was established, and suddenly from this episodic mass mobilization, very strong civic initiative with advocacy tools was established. And it was very special in terms of modes of events, size of protests, action repertoire, targets of protest, political claims, etc. People were protesting not only in Slovakia but in many other countries of the world, so that was very important also for Slovaks still at home, that people who emigrated from the country are still on their side. So, well, you see some pictures from the world. Everything was, speaking about repertoire, it was orchestrated almost as a theater, which was bringing people together as a community, giving people a good sense of identity. It was almost theater which can be used as an instrument for change. Many artists were involved, so you see them actually how they are speaking on Slovak squares together with Catholic and Protestant priests, Roma musicians, and Hungarian speakers. So all groups of society should have been represented. I will. The trigger of the protest, just to mention something of a theory here, was a moral shock. Secondly, the knowledge that the regime is broken, that it's not able to protect itself, and most importantly, suddenly we saw a new generation which was coming very often, the people who were returning from abroad, deeply non-ideological, gender neutral. Just for your understanding, the chief of the campaign of Zuzana Čaputová is 28 years old. He studied in Britain. He just returned, and the result is, and they prepared campaign which was going directly against all well-known inspirations of various campaigns from the so-called West. They used a very new tactic, which can be, by the way, utilized by others in a region in the future. So, and I know I'm coming to the end. So what happened? Zuzana Čaputová, these are her results, and you see the blue picture is where she won. The red are very rare parts where her candidate of Smer, Euro Commissioner Šefčovič won, and one particular district, actually the poorest in Slovakia, is the one where extremely bizarre anti-system candidate Harabin won. And just for understanding, since there are people sitting here, let's say from Poland, Zuzana Čaputová won even in Orava region, which is basically like comparing to liberal pro-Western candidate winning in Podhale, basically close to Zakopane, which is close to miracle. But she was winning even there because the appetite for a change was dramatic. Zuzana Čaputová is a lawyer operating within civil society basically since 90s, and among various of her achievements belong also that she was able to influence legislation process on the level of European Commission in Brussels years ago. Keyword of her campaign was justice, which has been scarce goods in Slovakia, and she became a face of a new style of politics not based on arrogance of power. And the reason was very simple why she succeeded. People have been desperate and tired of the emptiness of current Slovak politics. They were tired of bad governance and overwhelming corruption, and most importantly by ugliness of public life, which is full of aggressiveness, rough interactions, and I would even say psychopathy. And suddenly, you know, it was almost like a divine revelation when she came to the political scene, because Slovakia didn't experience that for years. Honestly speaking, as I mentioned already, foreign media described Čaputová's success as a rare victory for liberal forces in Central Europe, but you know, even President Andrej Kiska also represented a certain deviation from Central European politics embodied in Miloš Zeman, Kaczynski, and Viktor Orbán. When people were asked why they were voting for Čaputová, the most frequent answer was morality and decency, followed by the view that she's a new face in a country that needs a change. So, in other words, the political offer and social demand come together in a very rare way in Zuzana Čaputová in Slovakia. And many people in Slovakia believe that Čaputová might be their last chance to return to the ideals of the 1989 Velvet Revolution. Zuzana Čaputová has brought about the hope that optimistic variant, which I mentioned at the beginning, maintaining the basic principles of liberal democracy, will prevail in Slovakia. So, but let me bring also, and I'm finalizing, also the other picture. Support for Čaputová, if you look at all 8 regions of Slovakia, the first one is Bratislava. I mean, it's not surprising. So we can be very positive and say, well, she won in all regions. But of course, the poorest regions of eastern Slovakia, suddenly we see that those are the last 2, Prešov and Košice. The victory is not that stunning. I mean, in case of Prešov, actually even Šefčovič very slightly won. Speaking about strongholds for most successful candidates, the first one, blue, that's Zuzana Čaputová, and you clearly see that she was winning in urban areas and most prosperous parts of the country. And since I'm sitting in Hungary, also it's visible that she was voted in by Slovak Hungarians who somehow didn't vote for Hungarian candidate Bugar Béla, but they opted toward Zuzana because she was promising them a new style of politics and inclusion. Maroš Šefčovič, the candidate of Smer, on the other hand, was winning in rural areas and most importantly in eastern Slovakia. But let me show you also the last one, and that's a result of Marian Kotleba, our Slovak fascist, and we clearly see that he's gaining since last elections quite visibly. So in the next parliament elections, if the trends will continue, his party might get easily 15 to 17%. So we might find ourselves in the situation that Hungarians know very well with Jobbik. And the danger is, firstly, that it might paralyze the parliament, and secondly, well, not fascists are so dangerous, but the problem is that all others on the political scene are following their example, so they are radicalizing their rhetoric and policies. So in this way, Kotleba is able to poison the whole political scene. Just to bring also some other problematic issues. Zuzana Čaputová got more votes than Iveta Radičová 10 years ago, who was a candidate for a presidency in 2009 and later became prime minister in 2010. So she got more of them. That's positive. But at the same time, she received the least number of votes as the person who was elected in Slovakia ever. And you see that participation in the second round in in these presidential elections was actually lower. So people who were voting for anti-system political candidates didn't come. And this is the source of certain pessimism before parliamentary elections. So to finalize, I know I'm talking too much, the civil society was awakened in Slovakia, and the regime created by Fico was demasked for a few months now, and this is where we are. So of course many people are optimistic, but what we are experiencing is actually the drama, whether it's not too late. Besides the optimistic variant, which still holds a large part of the Slovak society, there is another one, typical for Hungary these days and even for the United States. In Slovakia, global trends may fall and successfully fertilate land prepared by the oligarchization of the country. Or, also thanks to mobilization of younger generation and civil society leaders, it might maintain liberal democracy in a country and hope for others in a region. Thank you so much.
Julie Smith, I'm only going to ask Michal a question on the grounds that I apologise I came in partway through, having arrived in the middle of the night. You talked about turnout in the last European Parliament elections being 13.5%. You've talked about the next general elections in Slovakia, but are the European Parliament elections likely to be a testing ground, and is there an opportunity for the fascists to come through in that as well?
Thank you. My name is Karolina Vigura. I have two questions to Sofia. I found your presentation extremely interesting, and I wanted to ask you two things. Well, firstly, there is this large work of neurobiologists and psychologists which you seem to refer to, and when you were talking about the fear of loss and reaction to change and loss, I started to think that in some of the neurobiologist research they're pointing out basically that people are reacting automatically to change and loss, and basically they freeze, flight or fight. So what exactly would be the political actions that the people in the UK, for example, took, that you would explain as such automatic reactions, if there were any? This is the first question. The second question combines the last presentation with Sophie's presentation, and if the populists are the ones who not only represent but also liberate people who are frustrated by the loss and change, then what did Ms. Čaputová did? What did Ms. Čaputová do? Did she liberate a vast group of people? Was the mechanism the same?
I will have a question to Isabel and Sofia, and it will be about differences between age groups. So one would assume that the older you are, the more nostalgic you should be, and the younger you are, the more hopeful you should be. But at the same time, when you look at voter intention in Poland, for example, you see that youngest voters are also among those who are most supportive of radical right, very nostalgic parties. And therefore I found it super interesting what Sofia said about imagined nostalgia, which is inherited from other generations. And I wanted to ask you whether both of you, while analyzing countries that you know best, you found a similar paradox.
My name is Mirjana Tomic. I have a question for Martin. You mentioned that there was a 20-year-old guy who did the campaign strategy for Čaputová. What were the main messages he transmitted? And you said that other countries could learn from that. What is it? Thanks.
So coming back to the age group, thank you very much, because it's a little bit counterintuitive what I have to say, because we didn't see that huge differences in age groups actually. I can speak to nostalgia as well as to fear, because interestingly these, or not surprisingly but interestingly, Sophia's and mine in our work actually do match in that sense a lot. But we obviously do see like a little line that points towards people, the older they get, the more nostalgic they get, and also there's a more element of fear. But actually that shift happens quite early in life. So, right, 15 to 25, there you see a difference. Then the 25 to 35, you see a little difference, but from 35 to up, more or less the same. So there is more like in the second half of the youth, or the the first half of adulthood, that something is shifting. And thus, I am always very wary when people ask me, so when you look at the young generation, do you see a fundamental shift in, is the bright future basically with these people? And I'm saying I'm not an expert on youth attitudes, but what we do see in the data we have makes me a little bit cautious when it comes to these sort of things. It seems to me that these things evolve very, very, very slowly. Having said that, it is very important to me, and I didn't get to point it out before, to understand that neither fear nor nostalgia are something bad. They're very useful. We actually kept them through evolution because they're very useful for human nature. And it's very interesting that they're totally independent of culture, of age. It's just like whether you do this you check for nostalgia in China, in Nigeria, in Colombia, or in France, you will see it's there, right? So if we kept it, there is a distinct kind of necessity for us to have it. And what's the connection between fear and nostalgia is that, look, if the lion comes around the corner and you got to run, you have to activate the system. So fear is a very activating kind of, it's activating your biology. So you can run and you can get yourself out of danger. However, once you have run away and you have hidden and the lion is away, you have to calm yourself down. So basically the nostalgia is like the trick of biology in order to bring us back in a projection of a time and a moment in time when things were nice and smooth, and thus we basically calm down our biology kind of processes within our body. I think it's very important to understand this in order, and Sophie pointed it out in a very brilliant manner, that it is used and transformed and manipulated and all that, and then we get in the realm of something totally different. But to do as if these things do not exist, or we could totally exclude them out of our public life, I think it's just illusionary, because they're just inherent in human, and we need to find a better way to deal with them, also in the political realm, and I think this is what we actually show. Or what we're trying to do with the studies we're putting forward. The message of hope, I didn't get a memo, but now I kind of picked it up. So the message of hope to me is, sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but I'm just going to say it. You can induce fear quite quickly. It is easier to kind of reduce fear. It is within the responsibility of our political elites and within the society of ourselves to check ourselves constantly and to look what type of argument we bring forward or not. If we do know that alarmist kind of messages resonate more with people, they are activated to listen more and they take it more seriously. It's also a function of biology that was useful back in the time, and it's hurting us now when it comes to our societies. However, I think it is important to keep that in mind and to also draw the conclusions out of that. Okay, and I'll stop here because I don't want to monopolize too much time. Thank you very much.
Let's continue with Sophie.
Thank you. I will also start on that second question first. I think it's really important to remember that nostalgia is a dynamic force, right? So it changes throughout people's lives, and it changes because it is inherently dynamic, because it's related to your perceptions of time and your lived experiences. So it will change for you as an individual throughout the course of your life, and also the age cohorts will naturally shift, and their susceptibility and preponderance to nostalgia will shift over time. So, I mean, for example, because of that, you start to see that, today's change makers and look, people who are looking to the future actually can be tomorrow's nostalgics, because actually nostalgia is about whether you feel you're on the wrong or the right side of history. And I think that those forces, those political forces that encourage that, are constantly changing. So something just on the younger generations that I found interesting when I was looking at nostalgia just in the UK is that actually the millennial demographic, which is not the youngest generation, not the Gen Z, the millennials, who really had their coming of age of political consciousness was Blair, 97, all of the excitement and youth and optimism around that, the kind of liberal world order that is being built consistently over the past 20 years during that period. They are now one of the most nostalgic groups in Britain following the referendum, because they feel, you know, this group has seen this kind of inevitable trajectory of liberalism being challenged. They're on the wrong side of Brexit. They graduated into the financial crisis. They have, you know, then they were forced back into higher education and slugged with tuition fees. You know, the ones at the forefront, you know, can't get on the housing ladder. So there's kind of, this generation is becoming incredibly nostalgic because they feel that the political winds of change are not in their favor at the moment. So I think that's an important point. But as to why younger generations also find appeal in far-right populist parties, they're not necessarily finding appeal in their nostalgic messaging, but in other elements of their platforms, their leadership and messaging style. This is something that comes up. I've just been doing some work in Spain on the rise of Vox. Their supporter base is unusually disproportionately young and male and unemployed. These people who are, oh, someone's shaking their head at me. I'm sorry, that's the latest surveys that we did there, but we can talk about this later. Anyway, they, you know, there's a lot of the appeal from the focus groups I was doing there last month on that was actually around their messaging style, their dynamism and the sense of energy behind them rather than the policies they were putting forward. So I think for the younger generations that can also appeal. And also, I do think on the nostalgia point that there are, you know, we see this with kind of, you know, the actually extreme right with the generation identity groups and so on. You know, there is a kind of appeal in for young people kind of trying to find an identity in the world, to tap into a kind of assumed historical identity. I think that can be important. For Carolina's question, you know, I think with these reactions to loss, it's also about this point around adaptation and so loss and the loss of status, representation, agency, and so on. That is living through that is a process of adaptation, and that creates a kind of compound stress. So a lot of these people are just kind of exhausted and weary, and this kind of, that language of that comes up very prominently in focus groups all the time. But I think that what this does breed is quite a high degree of risk-taking appetite, which I think is quite common across many Western populations at the moment. And so my message of hope is that this is also, to come to the second point of your question, partly why liberals can succeed in this environment if they can present such a dynamic force and message. I mean, if you think about Macron, what he did, and you think, you know, there is an appeal to a kind of movement. We're in a defensive reaction kind of framework at the moment. Everything is very dynamic, and you know, the old kind of status quo messages of incrementalism and a kind of conservative progressivism, that's not having a huge degree of appeal at the moment. But, you know, liberals would need to be kind of presenting a message that is as dynamic as, you know, being able to compete with these other types of messages. So I do think that political leadership matters, and I think the challenge for moderates is how to think about how they can, I don't think radicalize is the right word, but certainly light a fire in the belly to try and match the kind of dynamism of the message that's coming from these populist groups.
Thank you for all questions. The first one will be, the answer will be the shortest. Well, whether European elections might be testing grounds for parliamentary elections, yes and no. No, because the dynamic is very different and always been. Yes, in a sense that I expect equally very high and very good results both for liberal-oriented, pro-democratic and pro-European forces, and also anti-system forces in both elections. And by the way, at the moment, mobilization of anti-system political parties is definitely higher than anybody else. So fascists are mobilizing on every corner. Insane kind of a xenophobic Catholic priest whose name is Kufa, who looks like the guy from the Inquisition from 14th century, is campaigning against gender. So these forces are definitely more mobilized than anybody else, and results. So I expect the results equally distributed among Smer, which is still very powerful, liberal forces and anti-system. So I don't know how many fascists we will get into. We will bring into Brussels, but at least 2 is very likely. The second question, what Čaputová offers to people? Very simple, hope. Hope that politics can be different, because they didn't believe that it can be different. But of course, now when I mention that, you understand that this is very dangerous. I mean, this is a danger game, and President doesn't have such opportunities to influence everything what is happening in the country as Prime Minister, let's say. But she basically brought the hope that not only fascists do care about so-called average people, because when in 2016 they succeeded. I remember how I was commenting it also in Slovak television that in a way they deserve it, because for years they were very active on local level. They were the only ones who were coming after the flood, to help those 80 years old woman who was flooded. They really cared about, or at least they were showing their interest to average people. Other politicians simply didn't care, and suddenly, she showed the equally, visible interest. So, in a way, she returned to kind of original values of Velvet Revolution or the change of 1998 when Mečiar was removed from his position. And the third question about campaign. Well, that's interesting issue, because the campaign was basically based on not attacking at all other candidates, at all, to be only positive. Not a single idea which would be perceived as negative. That was first. Secondly, they were even utilizing attacks on her. They were posting them on internet. So when somebody attacked her, they immediately posted it on their website. And there were various attacks, including idiotic anti-Semitic attack when one of conspiratory media changed her nose in Photoshop into a Jewish one, So they portrayed her as a Jewish person. It didn't work, and they immediately posted it on their website, So anybody who is doing campaign anywhere in the world would tell you would kill their candidate. No, and actually it strengthened her, I mean, we are transparent, we have nothing to hide. This is how they attacked us, look at us. So she was in a way perceived as a victim of brutality, paranoia, etc. by some people. Thirdly, they were playing with the fact that, and of course, I'm a sociologist, I know what is myth of beauty, etc. So I don't want to go into feminist topic here. But I mean, she's a nice lady, I mean, she's a beautiful lady, and they were playing with it. And many people from Central Europe want to be represented by nice people, because, I mean, and Slovaks definitely want to be represented by nice people. And when you were asking people average people in rural areas why they are voting for her, they basically said, because she's beautiful. She will represent us well in Brussels. Okay. And I mean, it's kind of empty, I know, but it worked, yeah. And they were playing a little bit with it. And fourthly, they played with the fact that she's a lawyer, who is capable of doing something meaningful for the country in Brussels. You know, she is a person who can, you can contact her and she will solve your problem as a lawyer. But in fact, the message to anybody in a region, whether to take something from it, is just select right person that would meet the momentum, you know, the zeitgeist you have in a country, because opponents didn't have anything to find. And to be critical, one thing to be critical, but obviously, you know, since she succeeded, maybe my criticism is useless. She was not speaking about her eventual performance as a president at all. And I was critical of her because of it, but obviously it worked somehow. You know, many other candidates, and I would mention one who is kind of a leftist populist and the other rightist populist. They were very openly speaking how they would behave, what they would change, that they would be very strong presidents, to be somehow visible even in foreign policy, and they both got 3%. Yeah, she was not speaking anything about it, and she won. I mean, in a way, it's a negative message, you know, because, you know, if you would ask me what kind of president she's going to be, I might have hopes, but, you know, I don't know, honestly.